Hello, my name is Adrian Goldberg and welcome to the Byline podcast from the Byline Times. It's what the papers don't say, what radio doesn't report and what telly doesn't tell you. This time, England's local election results 2024 part 2. Labour held on to London with Sadiq Khan and snatched the West Midlands where Richard Parker won the vote after a partial recount, seeing off the incumbent Andy Street, who removed any obvious signs of his link to the Conservative Party. Do check out part 1 of this pod, where we talked to Adam Bienkov, the Byline Times political editor, about the overall picture of Labour gains and Tory losses across the country. We also spoke to Shaista Aziz, who told me that Gaza had severed the trust between many Muslims and indeed non-Muslims and Keir Starmer. This time, though, the mayoral results. And we should say that Ben Houchin held on to Tees Valley for the Conservatives, though, like Andy Street, he appeared a reluctant Tory, even forgetting his blue rosette at the count. We're joined by the Byline Times founder and executive editor Peter Jukes and Councillor Steve Evans, who's deputy leader of Wolverhampton City Council, where Labour strengthened its grip on the local authority, winning 17 of the 20 seats up for grabs. Steve, I want to start with you and just talk really about how much we can divine about the state of Westminster politics from local politics. Is there a correlation based on what you see and hear as you go around door knocking in your area of Wolverhampton?
Oh, yeah. Good afternoon, everyone.
Oh,
yeah. Absolutely, yes. I think if you look at the local election results over the last few years, you'll see a steady increase in the majorities for Labour. And without doubt, you know, as much as local issues do matter to people, a lot of people do vote on how they feel nationally about a government. And we've felt that on the doorstep without a shadow of doubt. I think people think the Conservative Party, their cycle's come to an end. They've run out of time, run out of ideas, is what I heard quite a lot on the doorstep.
And we've spoken before, you and I, about the particular charismatic figure that is Boris Johnson, who's been exposed on Byline Times and elsewhere as a liar. And at various points, you've suggested to me that the fact that he's a liar hasn't necessarily counted against him. There did come a point after Partygate where it did start to count against him. But you said that many people regard all politicians as liars. So it's taken a while, really, for the shine to wear off Johnson and that particular brand of Brexiteer Toryism.
You know, when Johnson came into government, it felt like he created a brand new government and not a continuation of Conservative policy. Whereas I think Sunak is the opposite. And I think very much people have the view that it's same old, and feel that he's weak and hasn't really got the answers.
I'll talk to you about Richard Parker in a minute, but let's bring in Peter Jukes. And Peter, you've obviously had an eye on London. It's where you live. And there was some suggestion before the actual count came in that Sadiq Khan might be under pressure from Susan Hall, the Conservative candidate. And our Byline Times political editor, Adam Bienkov, said that even Labour sources were telling him that Sadiq Khan was under pressure. Yet he very clearly maintained his position of mayor.
Yes, I think be very careful. I mean, Adam was very careful to say that Labour sources were a bit jittery. We know that Conservative sources, like in the previous election, saying Sean Bailey has definitely won, are always doing this kind of thing. But I think this was a unique moment where there was some concern from the Labour side. But he was very careful not to say there was any evidence of what they're worried about, which isn't unfortunately true of some quite well-known correspondents on our mainstream broadcasters who said it looked like it was much, much closer. I think that comes from two factors. It wasn't that much closer, slightly less than some more extreme polls gave him a 20% lead, but it was a good 10% lead. And that's because of a lot of what the government has done, fiddling with the electoral process. I mean, first they changed the transferable vote, first past the vote system. You had a second preference before. That was confusing. You know, would people switch en masse from like Lib Dem and vote for Sadiq Khan, or Lib Dem or Reform and vote for Susan Hall? On top of that, we had the issue, particularly salient in London, of voter ID. We've yet to see, we ran a Vote Watch project people outside, across the country, not just in London, saying if people having problems voting, very rather hilariously, Boris Johnson himself did, and he brought in the legislation. And with those two factors, they couldn't quite read the turnout compared to the last election with a transferable vote. As soon as the results came in, so they're quite high in Bromley and Bexley Heath, a kind of old Leave area, very heavy. More people have cars there. I think it's less than 50% of Londoners don't have cars. But obviously, we're on the suburbs of London where cars are more important. The whole ULEZ issue, which had played in the Hillingdon by-election. Remember when Johnson gave up his seat, the Conservatives narrowly snatched a victory there against the trend because of this concern about this emissions charge, though it affects very few people. So I think there were some concerns. But as soon as you saw the higher turnout in places in central London, East, and places importantly like Richmond, big Lib Dem area, high turnout, they obviously voted for Labour. So yeah, the punters seem to be wrong. It is interesting. I didn't think he'd go for a third term because there's a natural tendency for an incumbent. The personality might work well for Ben Hooch, and after 3 terms, it might go against the trend for the support for the party. But it was pretty much in line with expectations in London.
Yeah, and Khan, we touched in the conversation with Shaista Aziz on disaffection amongst Muslim voters, but not only Muslim voters, about Labour's stance on Gaza, which did, in some parts of the country, appear to drain support away from Labour. But Sadiq Khan has been quite keen to distance himself from Keir Starmer, hasn't he? He's carved out a distinctive niche, which is something that these regional mayors, also true to an extent of Andy Burnham as well in Greater Manchester, regional mayors have been able to do that. They've had the latitude to say, well, we are Labour, but we're not necessarily Keir Starmer's Labour all the way.
Yes, you could have wondered about Tower Hamlets being a depressed vote there because of Labour's stance, or the central Labour Party, Labour leadership, on ceasefire in Gaza. But that didn't seem to have happened. I just, before I get to more details on what happened with Sadiq Khan, is this great? We get to vote these kind of different figures, different nuances of policy. It's less binary. I think it just expresses the British people. And that takes me to the other thing, is that, I'm celebrating democracy winning in all these aspects, not just, I prefer Sadiq Khan and Susan Hall. Why? Not necessarily because he's Labour, because he ran an honest, open, transparent campaign. The Conservative campaign, as it had been against the first election, Zach Goldsmith against Sadiq Khan 8 years ago, ran patently racist, Islamophobic campaign. Half their strategy was he's going to make you pay per mile to drive in London. As I said, only half Londoners have cars. The air being cleaner might be preferable to some people. And there were these weird leaflets that looked like emergency fines. You link them through. They were telling you lies that he was going to charge per mile and taking your data. But the bigger thing, and Donald Trump got involved in this, a global effect to characterize London as run by Islamist extremists, full of knife crime, not safe for non-Islamic Jewish people to protest. All this disinformation about the city I love and live in. And I found that, distressing, but so heartening it didn't work. London is much safer than when I lived there as a kid, or when I first moved back into central London in the 80s. It's just a lie. And I find it horrific that mainly online, but some big commentators would say, Lawrence Fox, Daniel Wooden, they're all threatening to leave London because it's full of knife crime now. Sadiq Khan has won. Well, I'd say, make sure the door doesn't hit you as you go. London is one of the most tolerant cities in the world.
And indeed, the West Midlands, Peter, where Steve and I both live, sadly, relative to the size of the population, has a worse knife crime problem than London. That's not anything for anybody to boast about either way. It's a tragic situation that defies electioneering and sloganeering. I want to say one more thing about the Susan Hall's campaign, and you mentioned the kind of Trumpist tendency. There was also a suggestion, wasn't there, that had the count been very close, people were already laying the ground for a suggestion that the count had somehow been cheated or somehow rigged.
This is very disturbing to me. It's the Trumpian tactic, obviously led to the insurrection in 2021 after the 2020 election, Stop the Steal. And you could see the two parts of the campaign. One is, it's really, really close. Susan Hall could nick this, right? And then very, very quickly, as soon, oh, what about postal values? It's all been. Now, whatever your politics, and a lot of these people saying this, by the way, weren't Londoners, weren't British, undermining the notion of democracy, the notion that it's a fair process, doesn't suit anybody. The manipulation did go on, obviously, and I think we could say this without shadow of a doubt now, was that the voter ID was an attempt, as actually Jacob Rees-Mogg said, using the wrong word, gerrymander, to suppress part of the vote, particularly the youth folks, the ID cards of somebody my age in their 60s. You could use lots of different cards. If you're a student, I can use my, over 60 rail card. I get free rail travel in central London, but student cards wouldn't work. So there were marginal, and I think that's another heartening thing. At least it was clear cut. It's not like some of these other states in America where they're the electoral college, there's a few votes in Michigan or whatever. And for that reason, I do celebrate this fiesta of democracy in the West Midlands, in the Northeast. We have a Labour mayor of North Yorkshire. Who would have thought of that? I do think it's good, and that it went with some hitches over voter ID fairly smoothly.
Yeah, the mayoral victory in North Yorkshire, of course, includes Rishi Sunak's constituency, which may give him some pause for thought. Steve, you were out on the stump with Richard Parker, and I have to say that to many people in the West Midlands, he was Richard Who. Andy Street had a very high public profile. Obviously, he had been mayor of the West Midlands for 2 terms. He was a former boss of John Lewis. And many people felt that he had been a good and effective champion for the West Midlands. He also clearly sought to distance himself from what many people perceive to be as a toxic Tory brand. What did you hear on the doorstep?
Well, you're right about saying Richard Who, and to his own credit, he would say many times it's not about him. He just wants the West Midlands Combined Authority to be a success. And he believes it isn't. It's not working for public transport. It hasn't delivered on social housing. And as good as Andy is campaigning, and he's very effective, I don't believe he has delivered. He's very good at turning up, hence his nickname, High Vis Andy, but turning up to projects that he hasn't really delivered or played a part in. And I do think that worked against him a little. I think the public was starting to work it out. And I would say he was effective in campaigning. I'd say he was ineffective at delivering, if I'm being honest. And Richard Parker has constantly talked about the Black Country matters. And he's talked about engineering and our rich industrial past. He's talked about getting people with skills trained up for much better paid and quality jobs. And, I think that matters to people in the West Midlands.
Andy Street was, as I mentioned, very keen to not portray himself as a conservative. What did people make of that?
I don't think that was cutting through. I get, a lot of people say it's about the personalities. And to be fair to Andy, he plays it pretty straight. He doesn't, to the best of my knowledge, get involved in underhand or dirty tactics. But Andy is associated with the Conservatives as much as he tried to portray himself as independent. I think people knew what he stands for. He's a Conservative at heart, and that's what we've seen with a lot of his policies. And actually, on the Combined Authority, it's the leaders of the councils that help make up the democratic decisions. And some of those are Conservative leaders. So I don't think it was cutting through. I know Richard certainly portrayed himself as somebody that was going to try and deliver for the West Midlands and not be a high-profile personality, unlike Andy.
Yeah, if people look at what difference does a mayor make in a region outside of London, Andy Street would point to the fact of his control, for example, of the transport budget in the West Midlands. And so there have been new tram routes laid down, not as many, not as quickly, as many people would wish. That may not be his personal fault, but nevertheless, there has been an expansion of the tram network. But he resisted, and I quizzed him about this for an interview for the Byline Times podcast a few months ago. He resisted taking the buses under public control again, believing that the threat of going to public control would lead to a better performance by the private bus companies, whereas Richard Parker is committed to taking over the bus companies again and kind of bringing all public transport under one roof, which is how things used to be, I suppose. I mean, there were ideological differences between the two men.
I think so. And if you look at Andy's record on pots of money that the combined authorities receive to remediate land and support social housing, he hasn't used it for that. He's tried to use it for other things, and that's let some people down. And I know that there is money available to support housing. Unfortunately, it appears that money was either diverted, used on other projects, or just stuck in the system. And I think Richard knows how the combined authority should work and will deliver social housing, things that matter to people, like public transport, like getting to work, like having reliable bus services.
It is worth pointing out that you are also cabinet member for housing on Wolverhampton City Council, as well as being the deputy leader. So you do know what you're talking about. Peter, nationally, I mean, it's not a very complicated picture, is it? It really does feel as though the Tories are down and out and just hoping that something will turn up between now and the end of the year when they'll have to call an election.
Yeah, I mean, before I get to that, just start on the local thing on London. I mean, it's very interesting. And that's why I love these sort of more local and mayoral campaigns, is that I've, noticed the difference since Cllr's in the atmosphere. I'm sure it's going to impact on people's health, less fumes around, and also notice the rise in social housing. I think London has more social housing built in the last 4 years since the 1950s. That's unfortunately part to do with London's relative resilience to the economic decline and Brexit and the cost of living crisis. So there are, higher rates in London, and they can afford that. And this is where looking to the future. Yeah, the Conservatives are on their way out. I mean, all the polls have been vindicated by real votes, millions of votes on the ground. And everything is in alliance with what the polls have told us. And this is such a mountain to climb. It is just the dog days of 13 years of Conservatives. And we see basically the policies, as Adam Bienkov, our political editor, says, and our next edition is going to be about this sort of performative cruelty, this vice signaling. Let's go for homeless people. Let's go for work-shy people with anxiety and depression, their lone asylum seekers, trans people. This is all they've got left. And great tribute to the British people. They see through this. This doesn't excuse 13 years of relative flatlined wages, economic decline, poor services, particularly in the Midlands and the North with rail and bus transport. And something has to be done. So in this phase, I'm just hoping, if somebody suggested the longer they push it, they wait, the worse it will be for the Conservatives. But let's put another side to this. The longer Labour has to prepare for a landslide government. And I've already hearing, through political sources, mainly through our contacts like Adam, that Labour have already they've filled out their policies for the first 100 days. We don't know what they are. We might not know till the launch of the manifesto, and probably a good thing too, because from historical experience, when Labour lay out policies early, they get nicked by the Conservatives or, become the subject of intense sort of fire and speculation. Instead, the Conservatives are left with the culture wars, or as Keir Starmer called, a war on culture, effectively. And the British people are much better than that. They don't like to pick on minorities. They don't like to sort of blame others for their ills. And in a way, I was talking to great American writer who's going to done an interview for the next edition of the paper, Brian Klass. You might read his stuff. He's a great political scientist. And he said he's become a British citizen. He's American. He used to work in Washington and American campaigns. He said, Britain is falling apart. But compared to America, he said, particularly during COVID, there's such a strong spirit among people, such a great civil society. He said he couldn't imagine clap for carers happening in America. during COVID, even though their economy is booming. And so maybe out of this sort of morass, this economic morass, some great spirit has survived.
Also worth noting in London that Count Binface got more votes than the racist Britain First Party. Count Binface, who was campaigning on a platform of free croissants and renaming London Bridge Phoebe Waller Bridge, which I thought was great.
Always that does help. A great British sense of humour to get us through.
Steve, one issue for Labour, and I mentioned this in the part one of this podcast the other day, was the problem that primarily Muslims, but not only Muslims, have with Labour's national stance on Gaza. Now, obviously, that's not something that local politicians can directly influence, but it arguably took thousands of votes away from Richard Parker in the West Midlands. There was an independent candidate, Mr. Yaqub, who was standing on a pro-Palestinian ticket, and had those votes gone to Labour, Richard Parker's scale of victory may well have been much greater. Obviously, not all of his votes may have gone to Labour, but I suggest that a fair number of them would have done so. Do you think that's something leading up to a general election that is likely to impact Labour?
Yeah, I think it will have a little bit of impact. And if you look at the voter turnout for the Police and Crime Commissioner for the West Midlands, where it was just a straight runoff between Labour and Conservative, the Labour candidate, Simon Foster, polled about 100,000 votes more than Richard Parker. So it's pretty easy to see that some of the other candidates obviously took votes away from Labour. Now, it's a little bit frustrating. I understand people's point of view, but I just feel sometimes, on the left and the ultra left, on the right and ultra right, sometimes some of the politics is designed to attack the incumbent centre left or the centre right. So I'm pretty sure a lot of people have got strong views on Gaza, but I'm pretty sure some people may be using it to exploit the situation where they want to attack Keir Starmer in general, or feel that Labour is not hard enough left. And I'm sure this hasn't been the first time we've seen it. It won't be the last time. That's not to take away from people's views on what's happening in Gaza.
Can I just jump in there, Adrian? Because I very much agree with Steve that, we work a lot with members who have a lot of Muslim writers. I very much get what they're saying about Labour's, particularly its initial stance over the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And it's good that people care about foreign affairs. But what on earth can any government, Cameron, the Labour Foreign Secretary, do? In the Iraq War, we'd sent 100,000 troops. We were key allies to the American invasion to topple Saddam Hussein. We're a marginal player on Israel and its policies of Netanyahu in Gaza. America much more powerful. We have some involvement in the situation in the Middle East historically and some leverage there now. But it's strange that this is such a salient issue here. And it is about this sort of identity and polarization. You're Zionist, you're a Hamas supporter, a lot about the online stuff. But it's kind of symbolic. Sorry, I will upset people. I believe very much in the ethics of what people are saying and putting pressure on Israel to cease its sieging and attacks on the Palestinian people. But it's not anything we directly have any political power over.
Interesting thoughts, Peter. Thank you. Peter Jukes, co-founder and executive editor of the Byline Times. Thanks also to Steve Evans, the deputy leader of Wolverhampton City Council, a Labour councillor and cabinet member for housing on Wolverhampton City Council. Before we go, just to remind you that if you want to support this podcast, and we'd obviously urge you to do so, please take out a subscription to the wonderful Byline Times. It's a brilliant monthly newspaper which contains the best of our online offerings with content that you cannot read anywhere else. And it is a joy to receive it through the letterbox every month. Head over to bylinetimes.com for details of where you can get a subscription. That's over at bylinetimes.com. This has been a We Bring Audio production in Birmingham for the Byline Times and Byline Audio. We'll see you again very soon, but for now, thank you. Goodbye.